He tore it in front of everyone. The paper split cleanly down the middle, a small white scream in the hum of the lobby. Fingers, one steady, the other trembling, pressed the two halves until they crumbled into a ragged fan. A man's voice, hoarse with something like fury and fear, rose above the murmurs. "This check is fake!" For a beat the room froze on the sound of that word. Phones lifted like curious moths. A receptionist's pen stopped mid-scratch. A woman with a stroller clutched the bar to steady herself. Cameras, those tiny, indifferent witnesses in the pockets of strangers, tilted, recording the rip and the ripple it made. A small girl stood by the brass planters, the light catching on strands of hair that fell like a curtain over a face too young for that kind of public shock. She had always been slight, barefoot most days, though now she wore a pair of mismatched sneakers someone had given her. Her hands were folded at her waist. On them, the faint brown of cooking oil and the map of palms that had learned early to hold grudges and hope at the same time. She watched the paper fall and did not move to catch it. For a second, she looked as if the sound had come from far away, as if this was a story she had heard on a bus and not one she was living. Around her, the crowd exhaled, some in judgment, others in curiosity, some in the quiet recognition of all the times a small person was made to shoulder a big mistake. If you want more stories like this, true, messy, and full of heart, please like and subscribe. Weeks before, everything had been smaller, or maybe nothing had been small enough. Ricardo kept his life packed to the edges. His days looked the same river of people through the revolving doors, the same coffee cup with the ring of old meetings at the bottom, the same calendar with blocks of colored appointments that left no white space for anything unplanned. He kept a family photograph turned to the wall of his office, more because he couldn't decide where to put it than because he wanted to hide the faces. Divorce had been a calendar event. His daughter had taken with her a softness he did not know he had and now missed like a missing tooth. On the Thursday he found the half-wrapped snack. The parking lot was a furnace. The asphalt would have been a frying pan if not for the shade under his late-model sedan. He had been late, his tie crooked, the phone's voice insisting on attention in his ear when something small moved under the car. A white paper package, greasy at the edges. He crouched without thinking, the way tired people do when they still have reflexes for the unexpected. "Half," the girl said. She was small enough that her words could have been dismissed as child talk, except her eyes were clear, unsparing, and they landed like the truth on his sleeve. "Half." She offered the coccinea, crispy, warm, and smelling of fried dough, to him as if it was the only rich thing she owned.
He looked at the food and then at the hands that offered it. Dirt under the nails, a thumb that had a faded cut. She held it as gently as she would hold a secret. He took it. He sat on the curb and bit into the pastry. The crust gave under his teeth, releasing a hot spatter of chicken and oil. The shock of such ordinary pleasure, unmediated by silverware or reservation, cracked something in him. The market of his life, normally tidy and transactional, shifted. He felt suddenly indulgent and ashamed of being so surprised by a snack. "What's your name?" he asked. "Helena," she said. She didn't say please or thank you in the way well-brought-up children or polite adults do. Instead, she folded her shoulders and watched him eat, as if studying the rules of the world, who accepted kindness, who ignored it, who retaliated. Behind her stood an older woman with a shawl tied like a protector. Her face was a map of weather, creases from wind and worry, a mouth softened by small mercies. People called her Dona Nusa. She kept distance, eyes on the street, on the backs of people who might throw away dinners, on the possible dangers of taking gifts from strangers. When Ricardo offered them money, she refused. When he came back with a second pastry the next day, she accepted with a look that balanced gratitude and caution. It started in the only honest way good things begin, awkwardly. He brought a thermos of soup one evening and left it by the place where they kept their things. He left a blanket he had meant for the cottage he never bought. He started bringing books, old books from the office library, dog-eared investments in fiction and science that smelt like dust in good-intended afternoons. At first, he left them at night, anonymous and furtive, the way charity sometimes wants to be. The next day, Helena would be sitting reading under the same slab of highway, the book spread on her knees like a treasure map. Empathy didn't rush in like a hero. It moved in small increments, veering his commute to swing by on the way to work, staying a few minutes longer, listening until his phone buzzed and he finally let the vibrating demand pull him back to his meetings. He took pleasure in these deviations, in the way a man discovers a new room in an old house. He began to bring them things that solved practical problems. A dented kettle from the company's cafeteria became their pot. A stack of clean towels, microscopically cleaner than the world they'd known, smelled of bleach and safety. He spoke quietly to Silvana in HR, who had the soft authority of someone who had seen entire lives unravel and knock back together because of small changes. Silvana found an unused office on the third floor, with a window that didn't face anything particularly thriving, but at least let a real sun in the mornings. They cleaned it, painted it a jaunty color, and set a cot, an act both simple and subversive in a place governed by profit and risk assessment.
"Call it a storage room," Silvana suggested, playing a bureaucrat with heart. "Officially, it's not living quarters." Noosa laughed once, small and incredulous, as if she could not decide whether to be grateful or suspicious that such an official would break rules for their ease. Helena carried in a potted plant she had found at the market and placed it on the sill. In the plant's green, she set the room's first order. At the office, change moved through days like the scent of a new loaf, subtle, then insistent. People who had never known each other began to share food. Someone baked a pie and left it in the kitchen with a note, "For Ricardo's friends." Lunchroom gossip turned soft. People asked after the cots, after the plant. Where once the water cooler had been a confession booth for small career laments, now it was a place to trade tales of donated sweaters and neighborly favors. Not everyone was softened. Marcelo noticed the pattern with the arithmetic of a man who managed risk for a living. He saw the room not as a sanctuary, but as a liability. "We have policies," he reminded Ricardo once, leaning on the doorframe like a man who thought he knew the shape of rightness. "There's procurement, insurance. What happens if someone gets hurt, if there's a scandal? You can't simply bring people into the workplace and expect clean hands and clean headlines." Marcelo's concern came from a sensible place. He had numbers to answer to, and investors who liked clean margins and tidy reports. His voice carried the heavy cadence of someone who had internalized corporate caution until it was a religion. He was not cruel. He was protective of a system that offered him a certain kind of life he was afraid to lose. But in his protection, there was a tendency to forget human particulars, the way a blanket could change a night's sleep, or how a name might restore the sense of being seen. Ricardo understood both sides. He began to sleep badly, conspiratorially dividing himself between decks, his official duties, and the small, illicit kindnesses that felt like theft from the ledger of his responsibilities. He found he was softer with Helena than with his emails. He answered her questions about the sun, about birds, about why grown people sometimes cried in their cars, because she asked them with the blunt hunger of someone who needed the world explained in truth, not sanitized answers. Helena had a curiosity that sat like light in a small body. She learned quickly how to fold paper boats and how to stack cups so they didn't topple when the wind came through the vent. She could be fiercely proud and stubborn. If someone called her less than whole, she wore the insult like a secret, and then doubled down by teaching herself something new. She taught the office staff a counting game in exchange for paper, and the morning after Ricardo left a stack of coloring books, the elevators echoed with crayon hums. People came down behind their laptops and found themselves smiling in the kind of way that surprises you when you thought you were made safe from astonishment. There were nights when the three of them, Ricardo, Helena, and Noosa, ate under the yellow bulb of that borrowed office. Noosa told stories low and round, keeping her voice like a candle. She talked about a time she worked in a bakery, about the sound of an oven door closing, about a daughter who had left and not come back. She often looked at Helena with a gaze that threaded between fierce affection and a posture shaped by history. You could tell she had taught herself how to survive by reading the weather and people's intentions. There was no martyrdom. There was a relentless practicality that was itself a kind of tenderness. A volunteer lawyer came by one rainy Tuesday, a woman wearing sensible shoes and a coat too thin for sympathy, holding a folder of papers that smelled faintly of printer ink and other people's trust. She had been looking into dormant accounts after the city digitized long-forgotten ledgers. Helena had, through a chain of daytime shelters and a nurse who had cataloged names, found someone to listen to the story of a missing relative. The lawyer had found a trail that ended in a bank file, an old trust set aside for a relative with an unfamiliar name. You never asked for it,
the lawyer said when she handed the envelope to Helena. "No one claimed it. It was allocated a long time ago. The bank kept it quiet until they could make contact." The envelope contained a paper slip, a check, drawn from a dormant account and made payable to Helena Silva. The name itself hummed like a small miracle. Helena didn't know what to do with such paper. It was both foreign and authoritative, the kind of thing that could open doors or close them. The lawyer explained in soft, bureaucratic sentences what the check meant and how it needed to be cashed at a branch with proper ID. Helena, who had never owned a stamp and had difficulty writing her name in long, confident strokes, listened with the quick eyes of someone who had been given a map. "Take it to someone you trust if you like," the lawyer said, "or go to the bank together, get a proper account. You can open one for a minor with a guardian. It's all quieter with company." Helena folded the paper carefully and, as if following a child's ancient logic, decided to give it to the person who had given her bread first. She wanted to repay the man who had broken his routine for them. She wanted to hold something that made her feel capable. She wanted, more than anything, to show that she was not a passive object in people's narratives. She had agency, clumsy and bright.
The morning she decided to take the check to Ricardo, she dressed with a ceremony that would have made her grandmother smile. She brushed her hair the way a tale-book princess would, slipped on one of those donated sweaters, and tucked the paper into the pocket of the jacket. Noosa watched her with fingers that trembled, not from age alone, but from the calculation of how much entering a bank altered the map of their daily survival. "You don't have to," Noosa told her. "I want to," Elena said. She did not ask why anyone would think otherwise. Gratitude, she had learned, could be a currency as strong as money. Inside the company, the staff had prepared a little ritual without fully naming it. Someone had made empanadas, somebody else had brewed extra coffee, and the room on the third floor smelled of warm bread and new paint. Savannah had arranged it so that Elena could come in without disrupting the flow of business, with a quiet corridor and a receptionist who was briefed to smile and move on. On this morning, the sun slanted gold through the blinds, and the plant on the sill looked particularly zealous for life. Ricardo met them at the elevator. He'd been on a late night the previous evening, and his eyes still bore the rims of fluorescent light. He had not slept long enough to lose the mantle of kindness. When Helena reached into her pocket and handed him the folded check, the gesture was small and exact. "For you," she said. It was meant, in the muttering way children hope to be understood, as a thank you. It was also a child's attempt to be part of an adult economy she revered. She had seen checks in movies, seen them on television, seen the reverence with which adults touched paper that represented both promise and identity. Ricardo unfolded it with a casualness he hoped wouldn't betray what the paper might be. He scanned the name, the neat hand of someone from a different class of life, the bank seal, the amount, numeric and written out, balanced in a formal proof of value. It was more money than he could comfortably imagine as a single-handed gift. He did not know what to do with such a thing. He knew what the board would think. He knew how the lines on Marcelo's face would set like walls, how his own careful life could be judged in a headline, "Manager uses company premises for private charity." The thought of a scandal, however improbable, made his throat tighten. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had learned to hold risk like a ledger. He had also begun to be, in the quiet way that catches people off guard, softer. At the edge of the office stood Marcelo, drawn by the rumor like someone tracking a wild animal. He did not yet know the contents of the envelope, only the shape of reward and the possibility of scandal. The grip of his hands tightened on the paper cup he held. He had watched the pattern of favors like a meteorologist watches clouds. "We have rules," he said, not loudly, but with the weight of one who thinks he is speaking for the institution. Ricardo let a laugh leak out of himself, the kind that disarms situations rather than solving them. "It's just a check, Marcelo," he said. "Elena found some money. She's trying to do the polite thing." "It could be a mistake," Marcelo replied. "It could be, we need to know. Because if the bank traces this and finds something irregular, the company will be in it." He looked around at the faces assembling in the periphery, the receptionist, a few nearby employees drawn like moths to a story. Marcelo's practical voice warmed the room with its own kind of high flame, contagious, assertive, quick to reduce complexity into manageable forms. "Let's take it to the bank," Silvana suggested, sensible, mediating. "We'll go with her. We'll set up the account properly."
Good, Ricardo said. He felt the tendency toward the prudent rising inside him like a reflex. Yet when he thought of Helena's face, small, certain, handing him the token of her love, he felt a different urge, the one that had kept him visiting new corners of his life. He wanted to shield her from the indignity of being handled as a problem. In the hallway, a delivery man passed and whistled a tune that had nothing to do with what was happening, and for a moment the world behaved as if nothing strange was afoot. Then the bank representative arrived, an official dressed in the calm suit of financial authority. The man moved like a man trained not to be surprised, but when he took the paper, he paused, read the figures, and then turned corners of his mouth downwards in a way that suggested something both rare and inconvenient. "There are verifications to run," he said. "This kind of instrument should be processed with ID." Helena's small shoulders drew back. She did not have the right papers for the level of formality the world demanded. She had a name and a life, and a person, Dona Nosa, who watched where her eyes could not reach. That should have been enough, but the world, in its institutional wisdom, required more. Marcelo's voice sharpened. "We can't be seen accepting funds the company isn't aware of," he said. "Policies." It is strange how quickly fear can come dressed as caution. Ricardo felt it like a draft, like a hand at his collar. He had worked his way up by making the right decisions at the right time, and there was a part of him that wanted to protect the institution that had given him the tools he used. But there was also another voice, the one that heard the quiet details of late-night soup and the small bird-like laugh Helena made when she learned a new word. There was a moment of stillness. People leaned a little closer, as if being invited to misread the piece as a lull. And then, abruptly, like someone striking a match in a dry room, fear turned into spectacle. Ricardo's fingers closed on the check.
He looked at its printed lines, at the bank seal, and then at Helena's tentative face. A chorus of other people's fears rose. Marcelo's calculation, the banker's bureaucratic caution, the receptionist's curiosity. He saw his career, a thing fragile as a borrowed cup, and felt the weight of judgment crowding in. He did not mean to shout. The sound broke out of him as if it arrived from somewhere else. "This check is fake!" he cried. The paper tore. It was not the measured, considered action of an investigator. It was the exhalation of a man who had allowed too many contradictions to build up and had no other handle than this single theatrical motion. The sound of tearing was like a verdict. Helena's face changed all at once. The trust she had offered folded inward like a map. The hands that had minutes before given him the check now found themselves empty, as if someone had opened and closed a door without asking to see who it was that lived there. Shock is not just a state, it is a kind of conversion. Around them faces reorganized, some into sympathy, some into alarm, some into the slow, cruel amusement people feel when witnessing public failure. Marcelo's posture oozed a thin pleasure, the confirmation of his caution as righteousness. The banker's jaw tightened. Silvano's face moved through grief to a hard, practical calm. Ricardo's chest burned with a strange combination of something like victory and a remorse so immediate it was like a burn. He had tried to protect, what exactly? The company's reputation? The neatness of protocol? The well-ordered life he'd built? He could see in the quick replay that comes after humiliation the tiny collages of his own choices, the late nights, the insensitive decisions, the private kindnesses that had circumvented the system instead of building it better. Helena did not scream. She did not run. She simply stood very still, as if the world had grown a new and dangerous gravity. Her eyes were wet but not yet spilling. The light in them looked like a candle in a wind. Nea's hand found hers and squeezed, a small, fierce protection. Someone pressed a phone camera closer. The lobby's air hummed with uploaded attention, an instant optic that would alter how the story got told outside the building's glass. The torn halves of the check lay between people's feet, like the remains of a promise. It was paper, yes, but paper is sometimes all it takes. Ricardo watched his hands. He watched them as if they were foreign. He had wanted to shield the company from scandal, but the act felt suddenly petty and heavy. He had attempted to excise risk with a blade that also cut someone living and breathing and small. The publicness of his reaction changed everything. The calculation that had led him here, fear, policy,
The yearning to do right by his peers had become a spectacle that humiliated a child. Silvana moved first after the tearing. Her voice was small and fast. "Ricardo," she said.
"We should be careful." "That's not careful," Marcelo snapped. "That's decisive." Her glance said what she could not afford to say outright. "This will not end well." Someone in the crowd muttered the word fraud like an accusation smeared across the air. Another, softer voice said, "Poor kid." Both were true, in the way conflicting witnesses are true. One saw a threat, one saw injury. No amount of truth contained all the parts of this scene. Ricardo wanted to explain, to pick the paper up, to apologize, to help. His mouth formed sentences and found none that seemed honest and effective in equal measure. He felt naked, not because of exposure, but because the person he had been, the one who could balance obligations and soft spots with pragmatic ease, had been shown to be someone else in front of other people. Public mistakes change you differently than private ones. Helena looked past him, beyond him, searching for a place to put the sudden weight of shame. Her shoulders rose and fell like someone trying to remember a breath pattern. She folded her hands together and set them against the knit of the sweater, as if to say to herself that she was still here. A child can be resilient and still break. The two things are not contradictory. In the quiet that fell afterward, like the hush that follows a storm, Ricardo felt the eyes around him become a ledger where his name could be penciled into different categories. Some would say he had acted prudently, others would say he'd behaved badly and cruelly. He was not sure which ledger he would rather live in. He started toward Helena, perhaps to put the check back into her hands, or to gather up the torn pieces, like someone gathering the remains of an apology. His movement was a flinch born of two competing desires, to protect and to repair. For a second he imagined how he would explain to his daughter if she saw this footage, how he would hold his own hand and tell it that he was trying to be the man who did the right thing. "Please," Silvana whispered to him, not a plea, but an instruction. "Come with me. We'll sort it out." But the room had already rearranged itself into the opening bars of a story that would not be easily contained. People whispered, phones clicked. The torn check lay like a comet tale of what happens when careful lives collide with the messy arithmetic of human need. Ricardo's breath came in short pants. For the first time in a long time, he felt heavy with the sense that every small action casts a shadow farther than we imagine. He had wanted to be a quiet helper, an unremarked presence. Instead, he had become, for the world to see, both the man who softened lives and the man who could, in an instant, make someone smaller. Helena looked at him the way someone looks at a man who has just broken the only object of their trust. She did not understand all the institutional reasons one tears paper. She only knew that a piece of her gratitude had been shown the door. The check, whatever its veracity, had represented a choice. Its destruction was an eraser she did not ask for. Ricardo's hands, stained with the mundane residue of sandwiches and sleeves, trembled. He had wanted to protect an institution that made his life orderly. In the process, he had betrayed a girl who had only wanted to share a piece of her good fortune. Outside, the city moved on. A garbage truck roared past the building. The lobby clock ticked. Time, tirelessly, kept track of human errors and human mercies with equal indifference. He thought of the Cochinha, how small generosity had begun, and realized that his life had become a ledger he no longer found trustworthy. He wanted to be more than a man who followed policies. He wanted to be someone whose hands steadied others. But he did not yet know how to be that person in a world that counted on rules to forgive impulses. Helena's voice, when it came, was a small thing that surprised the crowd. "It's okay," she said. It sounded not like resignation, but like a gift she offered because she did not want to make the man feel worse. It was the kind of mercy that arrives raw and immediate from a child who has learned to shield others from the cost of their suffering. The banker's lips flattened. Marcelo nodded, as if the sound confirmed him. Silvana placed a hand on Ricardo's shoulder, the way a captain steadies a shaken sailor. And for a moment there was an unspoken plan. Damage control, reassurances, explanations that would, if executed precisely, clean the mess. But words can be inadequate, and so can promises. Paper can be torn in a moment, and no amount of explanation will seamlessly knit the halves back together. Ricardo looked at the torn check again, its pieces like leaves on the floor.
He felt the moisture gather behind his eyes, not yet breaking into tears, but heavy enough to make him blink as if clearing a fog. He had not meant for this to be the day he would discover the sharp edge of his own limitations. The lobby opens for 1,000 stories every day, people arriving to jobs, leaving with resignations, rendezvousing for coffee. Today it had opened for a mistake that would not stay small. The noise of that mistake would travel, and all of them, Helena, Nusa, Ricardo, Marcelo, Silvana, would have to live with the echoes. From the outside, people might interpret the tears, the torn paper, the shouts, in ways that suited their hunger for meaning. But inside that slice of time, under the same light where a plant still stood, the three of them, Ricardo, Helena, and Nusa, had their own private counting to do. How much of the damage could be repaired? How much of the kindness could be preserved? How much trust had been lost in one quick public motion? Ricardo picked up the larger half of the check as if it were a relic. The paper crinkled under his fingers. He felt the weight of the room's gaze like weather pressing on his shoulders.
Somewhere far off, a phone pinged with the first of what would be endless messages. Somebody would upload the video. Somebody else would tweet. The ledger of public opinion would start to be drawn up before they'd had time to draw an honest breath. He sank into a chair, feeling as if he had been handed a report card written in flesh. He turned his face away from the camera lenses and toward the window, where the city kept living its ordinary, unforgiving life. Outside, the light fell on a line of apartment windows like a row of eyes. Somewhere in those boxes, someone was preparing dinner. Someone else was closing up a small shop. The world, insistently, was indifferent to the accident of one man's poor judgment. But action came as it always does, not from indifference, but from the need to find footing. Silvana had already stepped into motion. HR procedures would be consulted, statements drafted, and the company would convene a cautious chorus of legalese. Marcelo would make his calculations and soothe his conscience with charts. The bank would send a team to verify, to be invisible and infallible in its pursuit of arithmetic truth. Helena folded her hands tighter. She had watched people do hard things. She'd learned to look for the good in their motion. She had also learned, by the small and insisting logic of her life, to find shelter in what matters. She looked at Ricardo and for a moment saw the man who had sat on a curb and eaten half a pastry with her, who had brought blankets to the cold, who had once read a book under the dull light. She remembered the plant on the sill, the way the office welcomed them into a room that smelled like paint and instant coffee. That man was still inside the one who had torn the paper. People, she knew, could hold contradictions. Dignity, she knew, is not wholly erased by spectacle. Behind the glass of the building, a reporter's camera lens drank in the scene. The world was forming a story out of them. How they would tell it, how they would interpret it, would be 1,000 tiny judgments that might alter the course of all three lives. Ricardo breathed in and out, trying to find a rhythm that would not betray panic. He had wanted to be the quiet helper. Instead, he had become the one whose hands made news. The number of ways to make amends was small only in appearance. Actions could be taken, apologies offered, explanations given, accounts opened properly. But the rawness of humiliation is not easily quieted by logistics. Helena looked at him, and in that look there was a question more ancient than corporate policy. Will you fix this? He wanted to answer with a word that would heal, yes, but he felt the inadequacy of small affirmations against the scale of what had been done. There would be apologies, surely. There would be statements. But apologies are scaffolding. Repair is the slow architecture of repeated acts. Outside the building, a bus hissed by, carrying passengers unaware of the tiny drama that had just reshaped several lives. Inside, the lobby's air smelled faintly of paper and frying oil, of coffee and cheap perfume. Those scents had been the witnesses to gentleness and spectacle alike. Ricardo reached a hand toward the torn paper, then hesitated. The room hummed. People leaned forward like readers turning a page they couldn't put down. He thought of the coxinha again, how small generosity had started as a shared piece of food under a car. He thought of the way hands can be both instruments of harm and tools of repair. He folded his fingers around the larger piece of the check, and for the first time since the rip, allowed himself to feel the weight of being both protector and perpetrator. The path to making things right would be long and full of awkwardness, he knew. It would require a kind of public humility that wasn't in his training manual. It would demand more than statements. It would demand restructuring the very way he balanced the ledger of his life. The lobby thrummed with the beginnings of a story. The torn paper rested between feet.
The girl and her grandmother stood aligned, small and steadfast. People felt that they were fortunate to witness something that would be told and retold, perhaps with embellishment, perhaps with cruelty. In their retellings, the rip would get louder or softer, the intentions would shift like weather patterns. Ricardo looked at Helena and saw all the ways a person can be both small and enormous. He had made a mistake. That fact now lived publicly as evidence. There would be consequences, personal ones, professional ones, and the only honest way forward was to meet them. He folded the torn paper inward as if to smother the sound. Whatever the check had been, whatever its veracity, something irreversible had been set in motion. He rose slowly, as if breathing could steady his knees, and moved toward the small figures who had made his life larger in the weeks before. He did not yet know how to say sorry in a way that would fix everything. He did not yet know whether the torn halves could be taped back together by words alone. But he knew, in the sudden urgent clarity that humiliation brings, that he would have to try. He moved toward them with the awkward speed of a man trying to undo something that could not be undone. His palms still cradled the larger piece of paper as if it might stitch itself back together if held long enough. People parted like reeds in his wake. The air felt too thin to breathe. Ricardo stopped a step away from Helena and Nusa. He looked small in that space, his suit a formal armor that now felt absurdly ornamental. For a moment he did nothing but watch the way Helena's fingers curled around the sleeve of her sweater. The rupture he'd caused sat on the floor between them like an accusation. "I'm sorry," he said.
It came out rawer than he'd planned. Not the measured apology rehearsed in private, but a simple sound, the kind a person makes when there is nothing else to say. Helena's eyes found him. No dramatic forgiveness, no theatrical collapse of anger, just a child's honest appraisal. "You yelled," she said. It was not a condemnation so much as a fact to catalog. Nusa squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "He must understand," she said quietly. But the words were intended as much for Helena as for the man kneeling before them. There was a long, practical list in her head: paperwork, shelter, the groceries they could not afford, that an apology alone would not fix. Silvana stepped in with professional swiftness, smoothing edges the way one might press a sleeve. "We need to get Helena and Nusa somewhere private," she said. "We should collect statements, call the bank, and—" She paused, then added, "and make sure everyone is all right." The banker's face had gone the color of overcast sky. Marcelo hovered, an anxious figure tallying risk. A staff member had already moved to sweep up the torn paper into a folder, evidence perhaps, or simply an awkward keepsake of a moment no one wanted to relive. They walked slowly away from the lobby's glass to the smaller privacy of the third-floor room that had come to mean something like a home. The plant on the sill inhaled sun. The cot looked less like contraband now and more like a fragile treaty. Helena kept her gaze forward. She did not look triumphant or bitter. She looked like someone who'd been startled awake and was now making a note of what had happened. What followed moved in two parallel tracks, the immediate private repair and the broader public reckoning. Silvana arranged for security footage to be reviewed, not as a punitive measure, but to clear up confusion, and she called the bank's verification desk. The small, sharp band of cameras and phones that had recorded the rip had already begun to send shards of the scene into the wider world. Clips would travel overnight. Headlines would try on interpretations. In the private room, Ricardo sat across from Helena and Nusa with his hands folded, as if folding his mistake into an apology might make it smaller. He told them the truth, that he'd reacted out of fear for his job, for the institution he had stewarded, and out of a reflex honed by years of making decisions where one misstep could cost careers. He told them too how the Cooksigna had changed something in him, and that he regretted letting policy be an excuse for hurting someone who had only offered a gift. Helena listened. She was old enough to grasp consequences, and young enough to still hope that people could change. Nusa nodded slowly, the kind of nod that measured the sincerity of a man by how his hand shook when he reached for the repair. But private apologies could not repair public wound. The clip from the lobby had already rattled through social feeds like a thrown stone. Some accounts painted Ricardo as a villain, others as a man torn between duty and compassion. The company called an emergency meeting with the communications team. Executives debated language. Marcelo recommended a firm statement emphasizing compliance and internal processes. Silvana argued for an immediate, sincere public apology and a concrete plan to make amends. While PR drafted neutral statements, the bank's verification unit went to work. The banker who had first handled the paper had not been unkind. He had been cautious. Now, with the torn check in question and a minor claiming the instrument, the bank's compliance officers traced the account number, the routing stamps, and the file trail. The little envelope Elena had been given, by chance, by paperwork that had made its way through a city clerk and into the hands of a volunteer lawyer, had left trails. Two facts emerged quickly and cleanly, like stalks rising from soil. First, the check had been drawn from a dormant trust account established decades earlier by a woman named Aurelia Silva. She had been a private person who left a small trust for relatives. Records showed that the trust permitted distributions to a named class of heirs should no direct claimant appear. Second, an old administrative error had left the trust in a limbo. No legal guardian had been appointed when Aurelia's nearest known kin were lost to time, and the bank had archived the account pending a proper claim. The dormant funds matched the amount written on the check. It was a technical truth, not a moral one, but a truth that mattered. The bank confirmed the check's authenticity. The checked box on the form was no illusion. Elena's name was indeed on a file. The envelope had not been a con. The story that had begun as spectacle turned now toward consequence. Videos proliferated. People argued in comment threads. Some demanded Ricardo's resignation. Others posted about the generosity he'd shown over weeks. The company felt the pressure of public scrutiny and the fragility of reputation. Marcelo's counsel, which had felt immediately prudent during the incident, now appeared in a harsher light, evidence that the institution's anxieties could become weapons that harmed the vulnerable they were meant to protect. Ricardo faced choices he had not rehearsed. He could decide to craft a defensive statement and hope the public forgave his frailties, or he could meet the consequences with the kind of repair that required more than words. He chose repair. First, he asked his legal team to step aside from defensive posturing and make room for practical solutions.
He offered to pay for the legal process needed to establish Helena's access to the funds in a way that protected her interests, to have Nusa recognized as her legal guardian, to set up an account that an individual could manage for a minor, and to ensure the money would be used for secure housing, education, and long-term well-being rather than squandered by well-meaning but inexperienced hands. Second, he made a public apology. It was not a glossy press release, but a small, frank address in the cafeteria where staff gathered and the cameras came. He said plainly that he'd acted out of fear, and that fear had become cruelty when it met a child's offering. He took responsibility for the public humiliation he'd caused and announced immediate steps. The company would cover the cost of legal fees, provide temporary housing support while the guardianship was formalized, and set up a fund for Helena and Nusa to secure stable living arrangements. There was no theatrical contrition. He spoke with the kind of weary sincerity that sounded like someone who had finally found the words after fumbling for them. People listened, some with sympathy, some with skepticism. Marcelo listened too, his face a landscape of recalculated assumptions. In the weeks that followed, the bank's compliance process continued, but with more human hands than usual. Paperwork was gathered and certified. A pro bono lawyer, one of those volunteers who had been before like a marginal hero in the city's small, necessary revolutions, stepped in to shepherd Nusa through the guardianship application. The process was not instantaneous. There were forms to notarize, proof of identity to assemble, and the delicate legal calibrations required to transfer dormant funds into active stewardship for a minor. At a small hearing in a municipal office, Nusa declared, calm, maybe a little astonished, that she had raised Helena as family, that they had survived by wit and thrift, and that she wished only to provide a stable home. The judge, patient and sometimes weary with similar cases, asked questions that read like safety checks for a child who had weathered too much. Nusa answered in the steady cadences of someone who had kept the small things, valuing them as lifelines. The judge approved guardianship under conditions designed to safeguard the trust. A portion would be held in a structured account for Helena's education and health. Another portion would be designated for housing and immediate needs, and an independent trustee would oversee distribution for a set number of years. Ricardo met them at a small bank counter for the formalities. He watched as the banker slid an official pen across a paper, and then looked up at Helena, who sat with the wide, slightly bewildered smile of someone who had learned what a legal signature could do. There was an awkward gratitude between them. She handed him a simple thing, a crumpled napkin with a child's drawing of 3 stick figures under a sun. On the back, she'd written in a wobbling hand, "For you." He kept it in his pocket like a medal for the wrong he tried to fix. The company followed with structural changes that felt riskier than any quarterly report. Ricardo, with the support of the board, reluctant at first but persuaded by the optics, and more sincerely by the moral urgency, proposed creating a small fund and policy for helping vulnerable people who intersected with the company. It was modest, a protocol for temporary lodging, vetted partnerships with shelters and legal clinics, and a formal volunteer program that connected employees with vetted community organizations. It was, in corporate terms, a managed compassion, baked into policy so that future acts of private kindness could be aligned with legal protections and reduce the possibility of harm. Not everyone liked the change. Some investors grumbled about mission creep. Marcelo resisted. He worried about precedent. "We can't make our office an NGO," he cautioned more than once, not without reason. Yet Marcelo, who had once favored prudence as armor, began to see that prudence and humanity need not be enemies. He took part in a meeting with the legal clinic and watched as a caseworker explained how small, coordinated efforts prevented far worse outcomes. Slowly, his posture softened, not entirely, but enough that he found himself volunteering to lead a compliance workshop that would teach employees how to help responsibly. Helena and Nusa moved into temporary furnished housing the company arranged, while Nusa's guardianship was formalized. The little apartment smelled at first like new paint and the strange civility of indoor living. They learned how to cook on a toaster oven that had a dial and a manual. Helena practiced signing her name with a steadier hand. The plant from the office sill found its way to a sunny corner of their new kitchen. Money changed some things, but not the essential textures of their lives. It meant less fear over the next rent payment. It brought a steady access to a family doctor and a school welcome packet. It allowed them to visit a park where Helena could run without counting the minutes until curfew. These were practical restorations, not miracles. They eased the constant, low-grade worry that had once been their weather. And yet the most important shift seemed to be in the small rituals that persisted. The cot's thin blanket was replaced by a thrift store comforter. The third-floor room at the company continued to be a place where staff left warm meals and books. People still brought food, but there was now an envelope of oversight and a list, simple, human, of needs maintained by volunteers who took turns checking in. Helena returned to the office sometimes, not to be the object of someone's charity, but because she wanted to.
She would come with a pile of pastries in a paper bag, offering half a cocina to someone who looked like they needed to be reminded that the world still made small, edible kindnesses. She brought the plant by once and set it back on the sill, as if the room had never not been hers. The video of the ripped check did not erase itself. It lived online, reframed and reinterpreted. Some pieces of it were unkind. But the narrative that grew in the days after was not just about shame. It became about accountability, repair, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Ricardo took part in interviews organized by the company's PR team, where he acknowledged his mistake and described the changes they were implementing. He refused to turn the story into vindication. He said plainly that his fear had manifested in a way that hurt someone he cared about, and that accountability meant more than words. There were, of course, consequences. The company's ethics committee recommended sensitivity training for managers and a clearer line of communication for charitable actions that intersected with work. Marcelo was reassigned to a role where his attention to risk could be useful without being weaponized into public humiliation. He did not like the reassignment at first. He grumbled in the way of a man who feels his competence slighted. But when he saw the difference a coordinated approach made, fewer legal entanglements, fewer frightened volunteers, he stopped grumbling as loudly. He even offered a grudging private apology to Ricardo for allowing fear to sound like righteousness in the lobby that day. One evening, months after the rip, Nusa came to the office to bring a steam of homemade pastries to the staff. She moved with a calm dignity that had been carefully grown. People crowded the kitchen to taste her cooking. They asked about recipes and windows for volunteering. She laughed lightly at stories, and when she reached Ricardo, she offered him a small, unadorned roll. "For you," she said. It was thanks without ceremony. Ricardo accepted it with both hands. In the break room, a framed photograph hung quietly on the wall, one of those spontaneous images taken on a volunteer day. Helena in the sun, smiling, plant in hand, a group of employees lined behind her in a sloppy, surprised composure. The photograph had been signed and pinned by volunteers who had come to mean more than footnotes in a compliance report. The hardest work, though, was not legal or financial. It was the slow, daily rebuilding of trust. Helena learned that people's hands could harm and could also hold. She chose to use some of her trust money for a scholarship fund in the company training program that would provide apprenticeships for young people with unstable housing backgrounds. It was a small thing in the face of systemic injustices, but it was Helena exercising agency. choosing to create openings where she once had none.
Ricardo kept returning to the quiet that at first taught him to notice people. A parking lot under a summer sun, the smell of fried dough, and the gentle courage of a child offering half a pastry. He visited less often because Helena's life had become less precarious, but he kept small rituals. Sometimes he'd park his car, step out, and for an instant check the undercarriage as if to make sure the world still had parts people could slip into and be seen. He called his daughter more. He wrote letters he folded into envelopes with slow, careful hands. He was not healed by any one act. He was, rather, practicing the difficult habit of being present. One afternoon, the company hosted an event to introduce the new partnership with the legal clinic and local shelters. Helena was invited to speak. She came up to the small podium with the same composed bravery she had shown when she first walked into the elevator with a folded check in her pocket. She spoke simply about being seen and about how a pastry had made a man notice her. She said nothing of triumph. She spoke of repair. Ricardo sat in the front row, the auditorium light softening the edges of his face. He listened as she told the room, with adolescent frankness, that people could change and that people should be careful with one another. When she finished, she walked down from the stage and handed him a single pastry wrapped in greaseproof paper. "For you," she said. He accepted it and tasted the familiar crust, the brief, ordinary joy of good food. The world, for all its messy indignities, had carved out a place for them that was more robust than a single moment of spectacle. The company's policies were not a panacea for homelessness, nor were the trust funds a cure for systemic inequality. But the small acts had multiplied: legal assistance, housing stability, employee volunteers, and a culture shift that treasured human particulars alongside institutional responsibility. Months later, at the little apartment where Nusa and Helena had made a small, steady life, Ricardo stopped by unannounced with 2 paper cups of coffee. He had tried, and sometimes failed, to be better. He watched them at their kitchen table, Helena tracing a letter in a workbook, Nusa humming a recipe under her breath. They looked like a family in a photograph that had learned how to breathe together. Helena looked up at him and held out a small drawing she had made, a sun, 3 figures, and a car with a tiny package tucked under it. On the bottom she had written in a new, confident scrawl, "Notice." Ricardo sat down and put the cup down carefully. He understood that the lesson was less about policies and more about attentiveness, the habit of looking, of considering, of allowing space for people to be whole. He had learned that tearing a paper couldn't erase the fact that someone had been noticed and helped. Indeed, the tear had only made the need for repair louder. There was no tidy ending.
Life kept unfolding in small increments. Helena enrolled in evening classes and started to teach other kids how to fold paper boats. Nusa volunteered once a week at a community kitchen, her hands finding work that made sense. Marcelo, chastened, began leading a committee to build frameworks for compassionate action that would not expose people to harm. Ricardo's daughter sent a message after one of his public interviews, short, cautious, and he took the chance, meeting her for coffee where there were no cameras. The lobby where the check had torn was quieter now, though the memory of the rip lived in the minds of people who had seen it. When Ricardo walked through those same revolving doors, he carried in his pocket the napkin with Helena's 3 stick figures. Sometimes, on a morning when the city had the patience of fresh light, he would step into the street and check for people under cars, metaphorically and literally, with the same humility that had once made him sit on a curb to share a pastry. Helena's life was not a punchline or a reward for suffering. It was a slow reclamation of dignity. The trust money provided safety and options, but her path forward was shaped by choices she made: to study, to help others, to be seen without losing her own agency. At the company, employees had started a monthly potluck that drew people from departments who had never spoken. The water cooler talks shifted from purely transactional gripes to stories about neighborhoods and how to help them. The 3rd-floor room stayed available in a formalized way. Volunteers kept a list of needs and a schedule for donations. The corporation did what institutions can do: create scaffolding that expands the bandwidth of human compassion. On a late spring afternoon, Helena walked into the office carrying a single coccinea wrapped in paper. She found Ricardo by the plant, watering it with the tentative attention of someone learning to care for something that could not be scheduled. She handed him the pastry and smiled with the large, unprotected smile of someone who knew she had been seen. He took it and broke it in half, offering her the smaller piece. They ate in silence, not awkward or tense now, but companionable in a way built of repeated kindnesses. It was a small, ordinary exchange, and yet it contained the heavy knowledge of how far they'd come.
Later, after they parted, he looked at the plant on the sill and then at a folded newspaper headline where the torn check story had been replaced by other daily eruptions. He thought about the way a single gesture, a ripped sheet of paper, a half-offered pastry, could balloon into a life lesson. He had torn something once in haste, and the tear had taught him more than any policy ever could, that notice matters more than convenience, that repair is harder than avoidance, and that dignity is the only real currency worth preserving.
He traced the edge of the napkin in his pocket, and in the hush of that ordinary office, he promised, quietly, to keep looking. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that small acts of attention change everything, and consider supporting local organizations that help people rebuild their lives.